Uhuru comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akile Anai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Today's study is highly important. We encourage you right now to invite your friends and family to it. Last week, we introduced a new series of this study, displaying the practical unity of Mexican and African people in the struggle against the colonial state. For this episode, we are defining the struggle of Africans and all colonized workers of the world, colonialism versus racism. For this discussion, I am joined by the African Socialist International Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa and one of the leaders of the Mexican Liberation Organization, Union del Barrio, the Undersecretary General, Benjamin Bravo. We will start with an overview from our chairman, followed by contributions from SG Luwezi and Benjamin. After thorough discussion among our panelists, we will open it up for our live viewers to ask questions. It's my honor now to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African Revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru, thank you so much, comrade, dear sister Akile. I'd like to just begin this discussion by recognizing that during this incredible period that we're experiencing now of heightened resistance by masses of people, certainly within the United States, but the truth of the matter is that the resistance has been growing for a while now around the world, and a really important contributing factor to how things are unfolding is what has developed inside the United States. And that's essentially because in the United States, with the United States, we see the center, even if only shakily, even if only in a shaky way, of the whole imperialist center. The chief imperialist hegemon of the world is located here. And because of this, what happens here can sometimes appear to be an exaggerated representation of reality, but it is true that the peoples of the world have been in a chokehold by U.S. imperialism for a long period of time, and the people of the world are demanding the right to breathe. And so here in the United States, the resistance of peoples around the world has been given greater significance because of the uprising stemming from the murder on May 25th of George Floyd. That's the immediate basis for it, for what has occurred. And of course, all of the murder of George Floyd happened within the context of the colonial virus that was killing African people and had the African community, colonized community in the United States in a state of lockdown and terror. So that was exacerbated, and the rage of the people exploded with the public execution of George Floyd. And so what we're seeing around the world, of course, is, again, really heightened state of resistance. And we are revolutionaries. The African People's Socialist Party is a revolutionary organization. Our objective, plain and simply, is for the total, absolute, unquestioned liberation and unification of Africa and African people as a part and fundamental, we believe, to the destruction of the whole capitalist system that rests upon a pedestal of colonialism, something we're going to be talking about on today. And so our party is in several places throughout the United States and various places around the world, but we're not every place. And we are not so ubiquitous that we could lead every demonstration, be involved in every mobilization that's happening, or even the vast majority of demonstrations and mobilizations, though our movement under the leadership of the party has initiated several of the demonstrations that have occurred and have participated in several others that we did not initiate. But the people, the fact that we have not been the leaders of initiating the demonstration mobilization clearly should indicate to us that the people don't need us to teach them how to do a demonstration, that the people don't need the revolutionaries to teach them how to throw a brick or something to that effect. What is needed is for revolutionaries to be able to intervene in the motion of the mass of the people and to take science into that, to provide ideological and political leadership for the most part, that would give an uprising or a protest a revolutionary character. We have the responsibility to turn protests, uprisings into revolution. Protests and uprising do not themselves make revolution. Revolutionaries are responsible for providing the kind of ideological, theoretical, and political leadership that would make revolution a consequence of protest. So that's one of the reasons that this discussion is so important for us, because it's happening within the context of the growing resistance of the people. And it's also necessary for us to recognize that in the United States, there's not much love for theory. Theory is not something that is easily embraced. And certainly among the African working class and the workers, other workers, that we have been so brutalized by bourgeois academia that we are hesitant to even engage in many ways with issues of theory. And those who within our communities who have access to theory are usually those who work for our oppressors. And generally speaking, we don't like what they have to say. And because they use a certain rationale of the educated to discourage struggle, to undermine us, and to show how resistance itself is a form of uncivilized behavior. Civilization, being civilized, of course, being something that has been defined by the European colonizer. So there is not much appreciation. There's too little appreciation for the issue of theory. And this is even among activists, and sometimes more among activists who are more concerned with getting action and than in getting ideas. So that's why it's important for us to entertain this discussion of theory right now. It's more important now than any time, because what happens on occasions such as this is that fast-talking servants of the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class, enter into the mix. And as they are doing every day, we can see that happening within the United States. And they, given an opportunity, they would provide some kind of leadership for masses of the people that takes them away from revolutionary conclusions and things that would help to overturn our oppression. So that's why we're having this discussion. I'm gonna go and look at a piece that comes from the political report that I made to the 6th Congress, and that was contained also in the political report to the 7th Congress of our party. It deals with the question of the nation, which is one of those issues that's really muddled in the whole world. And it is absolutely true within the United States. And it's, you know, a simple investigation shows why it's absolutely necessary to muddy this question within the United States. Because in the United States, what we have is a regime that rests upon a foundation of stolen territory. You have a government, you have a system that has its origin first in European settlers coming to this territory, running, in many instances, some of them, running from poverty and feudal despair, disease, and what have you in Europe, and settling in this territory in the employ of empire, settling in this territory and killing, murdering. That's a word like killing and murdering does not suffice to describe the horrible conditions, the terror imposed is unimaginable. It's almost hard to describe. And I think that profanity was something that was created to talk about this thing, because there are few words that can be adequately used to describe what was done to the indigenous inhabitants of this land. And I mean, yeah, so I'm not even going to give some of the obvious and notorious examples of brutality that the Europeans imposed here in the process of carving out, taking this land, taking this territory, something that has been romanticized in what they call history books. And so this land base here, this was the foundation. This was the thing that the settlers, that the Europeans who came here, and initially their objective was to extract value that would go back to Europe. They came here for empire. Empire was the project, and it came here to extract value, and they were doing just that, and came to a conclusion that they wanted for themselves, as opposed to being able to send it, being required to send the value, the stolen loot and what have you back to Europe. And they initiated what they call a revolution that resulted in breaking ties with the empire and holding on to this territory for themselves. And on this territory, they used the original custodians of the land, the indigenous people, and millions of Africans who were kidnapped from Africa and brought here to work this land. And so here you have a social system that has its origin there. And it's absolutely necessary for us to understand that. And if you understand that Europeans looking for what they call freedom came to this land, stole the land, killed the people in order to take it, kidnapped African people, and brought us here to create value on stolen land that contributed to the construction of an economy that dominates the world today, it becomes easier to understand that just because you see thousands of people in the street, and some of them are European and some of them are Africans, that they are not necessarily on the same page. They're not necessarily engaged in a struggle revolving around the same interests. And so theory is really important to us. I want to just take just a moment, and I hope I'm not, yeah, I'm all right so far, to just quote from The Question of the Nation from the book Uneasy Equilibrium, something that was the political report to our Congress and our 7th Congress. And here I'm quoting in Uneasy Equilibrium something from a book written by a man whose name was Hosea Jaffe. It's interesting that I should mention this, because I had lost this book by Jaffe some years ago, and I was in San Diego at an event that was hosted by Union del Barrio many years ago, later. And I think it was Adriana worked at a library, or somehow had some authority in a library or a bookstore there. And I spoke there, and I found this book. I recovered this book that I hadn't seen in so many years. And here's what Jose Jaffe says. And the book, the name of the book is A History of Africa. This is not an attempt to endorse the entire book or anything, but I thought Jaffe, was really insightful in the passage that I'm going to read. And it goes, the 15th century then saw the multiplication of the primary accumulation of European capitalism. And Africa played the most important part in the process as the principal arena of European colonialism, the very genesis and foundation of the capitalist system. From the turn of the 16th century, the Americas and Asia were added to this foundation and cut off, and out of this totality arose capitalism and modern Europe itself. Before capitalist colonialism, there was no Europe. Only a collection of feudal, mercantile, and tribal towns, farms, villages, discrete states, and kingdoms vying and warring with each other, just as in Africa, but on a different property basis, that of private property in the land. Europe then was neither a concept nor a reality, at most a vague idea that Arabs, but not Europeans, had long ago of someplace northwest of Greece. As long as Europe remained isolated from the world, there was no Europe. When it became connected with and dependent on first Africa, then the Americas, and finally Asia, it began to become a reality and an idea. Only when Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Dutch, English, German, Danish, and Swedish confronted and clashed with Africa, America, and Asia, did the need arise for them to consider themselves as a set, a whole, different from, hostile to, and eventually superior to Africans, Americans, and Asians. Colonialism gave them a common interest. And this is Jaffe. And then we say further in this book, this so-called common interest, the sense of sameness, common history, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture, elements contained in most definitions of the nation, was forged through slavery and colonialism. This was the nation building process, the sense of sameness and common culture of violence. I'm sorry, let me begin that sentence again. It said that this was the nation building process, the sense of sameness and common culture of violence are features of the subjective factors identifying the European nation. Contrary to white leftists and modern day Marxists, both the white ruling class and the white working class owe their existence to this process. They are historical twins, containing the same DNA and spawned by a history of genocide and enslavement of other peoples that is repugnant in its entirety. The parasitic capitalist economy is the objective factor, the material basis upon which the subjective relies. It is the bonding element of the nation that holds this collective community together. The European nation, and we do mean European, with its multiplicity of languages, classes, and internal borders, was born as a bourgeois nation, a white Christian nation, spawned through the blood and gore of slavery and colonialism, and resting upon a foundation of capitalism, benefiting Europe at the expense of Africans and the rest of the world. Aspects of the European nation's subjective content, its self-perception, were forged through the assault on Islam during the Christian crusades of the feudal era for control of much of the same territory in North Africa and the Middle East that imperialism is contending for today. However, the most essential component of Europe's subjective identification grew out of its history of genocidal aggression against Africa that included colonial slavery. Herein lies the process that bonded Europe into a single nation, though differentiated by sometimes competing capitalist centers designated as countries and incorrectly identified as nations. This, like the anti-Islamic national component, is residual from the pre-colonial European feudal era, where contending European powers defined themselves primarily in relationship to each other, except for the uniting, looting, expeditions through the Middle East that occurred under the religious banner of Christianity. Thus, the European nation was born white and Christian. Moreover, it was born as a bourgeois nation, as the center of capitalist production, stemming from parasitic accumulation of capital, flowing from colonial slavery. Even the European working class was born on the pedestal of colonialism and slavery, therefore ultimately realizing the benefits of an oppressor nation and identifying with its own bourgeoisie. And I just think it was really important to look at that, and at least for some kind of understanding of the approach of our party and our movement toward this question, and helping us to recognize why we say that the central question that we're looking at is colonialism. And it's upon this foundation of colonialism that the entire capitalist social system rests and acts and functions that it requires for its survival. It is the introduction of the parasite, of a profoundly a voracious parasite onto the body of humanity that was stretched across the globe. And today, when we look at how we deal with what's happening right now in this country and around the world, as oppressed peoples are fighting against all of these symptoms of parasitic entanglement, it's extraordinarily important for revolutionaries, genuine revolutionaries, to introduce the science into this struggle and help to bring some kind of clarity. And that's why we say that the so-called struggle against racism is misdirected energy and consciously misdirected. And much of what we see happening is not simply some accident that people would run out and say Black Lives Matter, as opposed to overturning this social system, as opposed to the slogan that we saw happen in the 1960s, even that said "off the pig," and that we heard repeated for the first time since that in Ferguson on Canfield Drive after the murder of 18-year-old Mike Brown, and the masses rose up in 2014 saying "kill the police." And the fact is that there is obvious conscious misdirection, and in our communities we see forces who were created through this process, where we see the element of class introduced in a very serious way into our communities through giving a sector of the African population an objective material stake in the ongoing existence of the capitalist system that sucks the blood and life out of our people, giving them a material stake in it. I mean, sometimes we have the African petty bourgeois neo-colonial forces moving ignorantly, but even then their ignorance is informed by their objective material interests. And they have an interest in maintaining the status quo. And so they would have us fight to integrate into the system that's killing us, as opposed to destroying the system itself. That's like becoming part, that's like uniting with the virus. You know, somehow you're gonna solve this problem by uniting with the virus, when the objective has to be to destroy the virus that's killing us. And so that's why we don't take lightly this whole issue of the kind of slogans that we see tossed around and put out before the masses. And that's why it's important for revolutionaries to intervene in these struggles and to take revolutionary science and that's why we're having this discussion today. And I want to really express a profound, important welcome again to Comrade Benjamin Prado from Union del Barrio, our sister party that we have been working with for more than 35 years, longer than most marriages have been able to survive, certainly in this country. And then, of course, Comrade Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa, who has had the responsibility for a long time now of extending the party's reach throughout Africa and Europe, and to various other places outside of the United States. So I just want to welcome everybody and turn it over to dear Sister Akile, who will give us some leadership moving forward. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, I just want to really appreciate and thank you for that profound overview. And now we're going to turn it over to Comrade Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa of the African Socialist International. So Uhuru SG Luwezi.
Yes, Uhuru, Comrade Director Akili. I just want to start by saluting my leadership, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, for giving me basically the privilege and honor to be in this study. Also want to salute Comrade Benjamin Prado. It's really a pleasure to have you on this forum. Basically, this question of colonialism versus racism, as the chairman just said, is consciously done. It's not an improvisation. It's something the imperialist rulers, intellectuals work at to undermine the consciousness of the vast majority of colonized people around the world. First of all, what it does, this concept of racism, it really puts Europeans, white people, really in the center. It obscures even the past of Europe. I want to say the past of Europe, that Europe was dependent from the beginning for its access to what is referred to today as civilization. Even the word of Europe itself, you know, if you Google it, you check it, you know, you will find out that it comes from Phoenicia. Phoenicia is basically today Lebanon, but what they don't tell you, Phoenicia was part of Africa, part of Egypt, and Europa is the name of a princess from Phoenicia. So basically, it's an Egyptian princess name. But you know, and if you put racism in front, so how can you justify if the name you have of Europe is not an indigenous name to Europe? And Europe, you know, they have a writing system, as we all know, and numeracy system. They're borrowed, you know, from Africa, from ancient Egypt. Today, you know, people speak French and English and so on. But if you begin to analyze the amount of borrowing in French language that came from Arabic, you will be just stunned. So racism obscures all those things. And it's also a significance to deal with this question. If you go, for example, just in Asia, in Japan, you all know the history of Japan. Japan attempted to colonize Asia. You know, that was no a question of racism because we will recognize that Japan, China, Vietnam, you know, other countries in Asia, they belong to the same, you may say, group of people, you know, in the way they look. So the fundamental contradiction between Japan and China that led to the Second World War, or even the First World War, to begin with, was not a racial question. It was that Japan made the decision that Asia is going to be oppressed and exploited by Japanese. That's the decision the Japanese ruling class made. Japan entered an alliance with Germany, with Italy. In fact, when Japanese soldiers were fighting the British in Asia, the Italians sided with them. But you would say Italians are Europeans, British are Europeans. So if it's a racist alliance, then they should just stick together. But they didn't, because everyone was trying to pursue their own interests. And if you look at even the way the struggle unfolded in Asia, you will see the class consciousness in Asia was sharpened by the fact also that Japan was the colonizer, was the oppressor. So not only they have to deal with the French imperialism, with the British imperialism, the US imperialism, they also have to deal with the Japanese imperialism, who look just like them. And this really had a profound impact, you know, because Africans, this discussion, how comes a revolution succeeded in Asia, but it didn't succeed in Africa? People have to understand the class consciousness. Basically, the colonial question was fully understood in that part of Asia. And you look at the question of immigration, and there is a connection between the factors colonization, the way it was understood in Asia because of Japanese colonization, immigration. At one point, if you're Chinese, you come into Britain, France, if you're an immigrant, if you don't have your papers, you should be concerned. In fact, you had all these white press basically criminalizing all the oppressed people, all the immigrants, and Chinese were part of it. But since China has become a power, since China is no longer colonized, we saw, for example, in Britain, we saw Boris Johnson, who is the current Prime Minister of Britain, when he was the mayor of London, traveling to China, trying to secure Chinese tourists, travel to UK, make it easy for the Chinese tourists to come to UK. It was no racial question. It was the British recognized their own interest, that they want to keep the economy at flow. They need money to come from China. They didn't say Chinese are not white, but Chinese had the money. So they were motivated by their own material interest. They weren't motivated by the racial interest. And that's how now, all of a sudden, you had a Chinese tourist, coming from China in millions, not coming to Europe, but going to France. So Spain, they all organize themselves throughout Europe to make sure Chinese do visit them. So they're no longer, considered as illegal immigrants. Now they have the money. The British and the rest of the white ruling class wants money. The same also for a student. Chinese student now represent a lot of money for Europe, including America too. So this question of power as a response to the struggle against colonialism is real. When we say that in order to solve the colonial question, we need to have our own power, and that has to be an international power, because you cannot have power until that power, as far as African nation is concerned, until that power is international power. So it means you're free in Haiti, it means also you're free in Brazil, it also means you're free in Senegal, you're free basically everywhere Black people are located. And you can also look at this colonial question when you go to what they call the Middle East today. Look at Israel with the occupation of Palestine. You have the Saudi Arabia, the ruling class there. They see the interest in colonialism. They see the interest, being protected by Israel to a certain extent. They'll make alliance with Israel against Syria. They'll make an alliance with Israel, with the US, of course, against Saddam Hussein. At one point, when it became clear that the United States didn't want Saddam Hussein to be a regional power. But the point is, you have the ruling class in the Middle East, particularly around Saudi Arabia and what they call Emirates and places like that, being more united with white power, with imperialist white power. They're being united with their own people. They're being united with Palestine. They're fighting the oppressor, fighting the colonizer, get Israel colonizers, settler colonizers out of the Middle East, than being with the Palestinians to be free. When the Palestinian are Arabs, they are Muslims. So is Saudi, so is the Emirates, so is most of the ruling class over there. But clearly, they sided with the occupiers. And so the question of racism, what it does, it obscures completely the colonial question at all levels. When I say the all levels, I'll take the example of the wars. These imperialist world wars, like the first imperialist war and also the second imperialist war. This may also be true for our wars. They only told us in the schools and also in the press and everywhere, it's an imperialist war. And they say, between the bandits or the bad guy, Hitler, and the good guy, they say it's the Americans, the French, and so on. and we the colonized are completely out of the picture. Nobody talks about us. And when they do, then we can see us being in the armies, fighting on the side of whoever colonized you. But it's more than that, because we say all along the problem is parasitic capitalism, and parasitic capitalism means that colonialism is the foundation of capitalism, and it's parasitic all along the way. And you take the example of this of imperialist war. I have some information here. In the case of Belgium, for example, came out of the Second World War free of debt. They didn't have to borrow money, because all along in Africa, in the Congo in particular, we funded, against our will, of course, the war effort of Belgium. And they say that out of Congo, 4 billion went to pay the Belgian war effort. And they saying that, just speaking of strictly the war effort, we paid 4 billion of French francs. I'm not sure in today's currency, but just it's a billion, so it's a huge amount. And not only we paid that, but we also died fighting for our oppressors. 40,000, some figure like that. That's a huge figure. Died just in that process. And the Belgian colonizers in some part of Congo, in Kivu provinces, they made an estimate that Congo produced 15 billion Belgian franc just during the war period between 1940 and 1945, just to keep Belgium at float, just to feed Belgium, not just to sustain the war effort, but to kill Belgium afloat. So when Belgium was fighting, we were paying for everything, not just for the military effort. We were fighting. We were also, for the food, for everything that Belgium needed, Congo was producing. And this is their own estimate: 15 billion francs, Belgian francs. So when you say the question is racism, it does obscures the whole relationship we have. It does obscure all the money we produce. It does obscures all this. And you could begin just to understand the significance of the figures I'm giving you. In 1921, the Belgian budget was 2.4 billion. So it gives you an idea of what the colonies produced, the significance of the colonies, how white power is dependent on the colonies, it's dependent on our labor, on our resources, and that is really critical. So the question of racism is a waste of time. It just not only marginalize our significance, and it keeps the oppressors in the center, and it really narrows everything. We're trying just to be accepted, to be close to the oppressors, when in reality, the oppressors depend on every aspect of their lives on the colonized. So, and this is just one example. And if I look at the basically how colonialism worked for the Belgium, we take the city of Hoboken. Hoboken is in Belgium, and they have industrial plants that transform the gold out of copper and the silver. And the silver was a byproduct of some of the copper transformation. That's real relationship, economic relationship. You have a city of Hoboken, the economy dependent on the resource coming from Africa. And you take another city, Ulen. Ulen specialized in the transformation of cobalt, treatment of uranium and radium. And you take Antwerp. Antwerp is a city, is a maritime city. It's a city by the sea. That's where the ports, the main ports for Belgium. Belgium doesn't produce any diamond. They don't have any diamond in Belgium. But today, Antwerp is their largest diamond market in Europe. And also the largest place where diamond is cut. They specialize in that. And in Africa, if you take Sierra Leone produce diamond, Congo produce diamond in other places, we don't cut the diamond. We don't sell the diamond. There is no market to sell diamond in Africa. And that's colonialism. That's no racism. That's colonialism, taking our resources, taking our labor, and building Europe, developing Europe at our expense. That's colonialism. That's what we need to fight against, so that we keep our diamond in Africa. If the person wants to buy a diamond, Africa is united, so we have our own common market for diamond. So we industrialize Africa, so we can cut the diamond ourselves. We transform the copper from Zambia, Congo, and elsewhere ourselves. And Ghana is another city in Belgium. They specialize in cotton. Of course, they've been getting cotton before the Berlin Conference, coming from the Americas, produced by Africans in the US and elsewhere. And then after Berlin Conference, they start getting cotton from Congo and places like that. So the significance of those of the city of Ghana is in colonialism. No production of cotton, Ghana has no significance. And you can say the same thing for Antwerp and for any city. You can come to England, you want to talk about Liverpool, is the slave trade that made Liverpool significant. You go to Bristol, it's the slave trade that made Bristol significant. And you know, for every city in Europe you look at what types of industry are located in that city, and you begin to understand how colonialism is significant. And so I can take more examples like this, but I wanted to just take something from, there is a book I have here. It says The Future is Asian by Parag Khanna. And because when we talk about the current crisis, we do say because of the success of China, one factor is definitely the success of China. And we don't want people to be confused to think this is a racial question between China and the United States. No, it's a profound economic question. So I go first on page 112. We just want people to begin to understand really the significance of the success of China. So I'm going to read from here very quickly. After September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks, Pakistan became the major conduit for NATO supplies into Afghanistan, making the country an indispensable front line in the US-led war on terror. But as the weapons, funds, and political support dry up, Pakistan needs a new strategic raison d'etre. The answer, becoming Central Asia's reliable conduit to the Arabian Sea, has been in the works for decades, but has now taken pole position among the numerous competing visions for Pakistan's future. After India and China's early 1960s border dispute in the Western Himalayas, China began to extend the high altitude Karakoram Highway through Pakistan along the Indus River to Karachi. Through this north-south transversal has been useful for transportation within Pakistan. It has done little to heal the country's east-west divide between the fertile Punjab and Sindh east of the Indus River and the barren, rugged Pashtun and Baluch regions on its west. The United States, 20 billion in military assistance to Pakistan since 2001, has focused on counterterrorism, but has done little for long-term economic growth. Only in 2014 did Pakistan textile export to Europe surpass a more 6 billion. It was once a truism that to comprehend Pakistan, you needed to grasp the roles of Allah, the army, and America. The first two still hold sway, but America has been decisively replaced as the third A. by Asia. Pakistan, like other Asian countries, has become fed up with being a supplicant to the United States. The former cricket star turned national political leader, Prime Minister Imran Khan, says what almost everyone in the country seems to feel, that Pakistan should stop being a hired gun for the United States and a scapegoat for US failures in Afghanistan. Furthermore, the more the United States threatened to withhold IMF funding to stave off Pakistan's debt crisis, the more the country is pushed into the arms of China, an historical patron, Saudi Arabia, which quickly provided $6 billion bailout. Indeed, Pakistan is fully embracing its Asianization. In 2015, Pakistan signed an all-weather strategic partnership with China. And as soon as Trump reduced US military assistance in 2017, Pakistan and China declared that all the trade will be denominated in their own currencies rather than the dollar. Pakistan consulate in Shanghai and Chengdu had been working overtime to dole out visas to Chinese merchants and heading over the Karakoram Mountains, or flying directly on new routes between Chengdu and Pakistan cities. The total value of the China-Pakistan economic corridor is said to exceed 60 billion in capital allocated to electricity generation, roads, railways, fiber optic internet, manufacturing, and agriculture projects, an estimated 3 million jobs in power plants, level, tanneries, and industrial parks, making everything from medical devices to solar panels are attributable to CPC. 82% of Pakistani have a favorable view of China, and TV commercials show recently TV commercials show recently arrived Chinese families welcome into local homes to share fragment meals, with more than 30,000 Chinese taking residence in Pakistan from 2014 and 2016. I can read more passages like this in this book just to see how the world is changing, how the United States is losing, how China's power is growing, and how Asia is being transformed at the expense of course, of the United States. And these are what Africans need to realize. These are what Africans need to understand. That people are not waiting for white people. People are not waiting for North America or for Europe. People, the world needs development. They want to be free. They don't want to be dominated anymore, and they want real changes. And these just one of the example. Just people need to become aware of that the world is not what it used to be, and we also Africans have to be part of that. And racism, you have to stop putting that in the center. It's colonialism that has made Europe what it is. Leopold II, the King of Belgium, when he went to Congo, he was worth 15 million Belgian franc, 15 million, and most of it, some of it was just the asset he had in the buildings, and some gold. But when he went to Congo, he became a multi-billionaire. That's no racism, that's colonialism that made him a multi-billionaire. There is somebody from Israel, it's called Dan Hitler. He went to Congo just recently with Kabila. He lent Kabila's government $100 million. Now he's a multi-billionaire. That's no racism, that's colonialism. That's the loot, in Africa that made this guy a multi-billionaire. And you can talk about Apples, you can talk Microsoft, you can talk about Samsung. It's not just they selling us all these smart, things, so it's basically the looting in Africa, the looting of our labor that's creating, making the wealth. So I just want to appreciate, the opportunity to be on this platform. And the late destroy colonialism, it destroy white colonial power.
Uhuru S. Luwezi, and just really want to appreciate that contribution. And before we go into a panelist discussion, I want to bring up our comrade, the Secretary General of Union del Barrio, Benjamin Prado. Huru Benjamin.
Uhuru comrades, on behalf of Union del Barrio, again, we really want to appreciate the opportunity to intervene in this really important discussion for us as Union del Barrio. You know, this historic relationship between our organization and the African People's Socialist Party, you know, for more than 35 years, really, you know, represents that the articulation of revolutionary unity. Principled unity, and we do owe that, and it's important that we recognize that, you know, to our founding comrade Ernesto Bustillos for building that relationship, for having this important relationship with comrade Omali in particular, but the party in general. And for Unión del Barrio, you know, to intervene in this kind of discussion is critical, because we recognize the significance of having unity amongst Africans and Mexicans as an important step towards, you know, challenging our oppressors from continuing to exploit our labor, from continuing to slander us as a peoples on our own land, and the importance of numerical power, but also, and more importantly, of what we're dealing with today, ideological power. And so, you know, just to give a brief context to our organization, Unión del Barrio, so that the audience can really grasp, you know, who are we and what is it that we really want. Unión del Barrio believes that Mexicanas, Mexicans living both in Mexico and in the Southwest United States suffer from political, economic, and social insecurity because the United States government stole the northern half of our national territory during its invading war of 1846 to 1848. And that's important because the question of colonialism is based on a material extraction of wealth. There's a material basis for our struggle as being an anti-colonial struggle. And it's important because we recognize that California, Colorado, Arizona, Texas, Utah, Nuevo Mexico, and Nevada, we recognize that as constituting occupied Mexico, or what we have historically referred to it as Aztlán, Mexico Ocupado. And it belongs to the Mexican indigenous peoples of this territory. And we say that because it's really on this question of colonialism, we have to recognize the material basis of what is affecting us. Because if not, then we deal with the struggle of struggling against the symptoms of the contradiction that we face on a daily basis, whether it be police shootings, whether it be being captured by the immigration and customs enforcement, whether it be the massive incarceration of our people, as just representing some kind of feeling of antagonism and hostility that comes from the institutions of oppression, which are expressed through laws, which are expressed through attitudes by police, but without recognizing what the fundamental question and contradiction is, which we do recognize is colonialism because of its material basis, right? And so as we see colonialism, you know, four aspects of colonialism, one being the natural resources that is stolen in order to accumulate wealth for a very small number of individuals, right? And even if we take the whole totality of this US settler colonial nation, representing only 4% of the world's population, yet consuming more than 25% or 30% now of the world's natural resources, we see the material basis for US empire, for US imperialism. Number two, the use of the material resource of human labor used by the colonizer, by this economic system, to subject our peoples to the extraction of our labor in order to produce and recreate this terrible system of capitalist accumulation. It is our labor that produces and creates the real world. It is our labor that feeds our communities. It is our labor that builds the roads, that builds the housing, that creates massive amounts of infrastructure and wealth, but we rarely see any of the fruits of that labor. Number three, using our colonies or using our own neighborhoods as internal colonies to this sick settler colonial state. And that's important because that's, this whole question of redlining, as people have more commonly now been referring to, is nothing new. It has been implemented in a large scale or macro scale through creating what are known as reservations, right? Putting people in completely destitute conditions where our reproduction of our existence is dependent on the colonizer, on the oppressor, right? Our communities completely are denied necessary infrastructure, like even a grocery store sometimes where we can get nutritious foods. Instead, we get all this colonizer food in the form of junk food and fried chicken or pizza or burgers or even these fast food restaurants that feed us all this poison and create health conditions for our own working class peoples and communities. And the characteristics of colonialism reproduce itself wherever capitalism exists, right? And it's important for us also, to highlight that the only reason why we as Mexicano indigenous people even speak English or Spanish is because we were colonized, because our history, our language, our culture, our science was destroyed as a consequence of invasion, war, and occupation by the European colonizers more than 500 years ago. And for us as indigenous peoples, we have to, again, build anti-colonial struggle to reclaim much of that has been destroyed and distorted. And so part of colonialism is also giving us or imposing upon us a worldview that represents the interest of our colonizer, the interest of the oppressor, the interest of the slave master, right? And so for us, it's really critical and important to see our struggles as Mexicanos. And I know that there has been criticisms, for example, of even us as Mexicans, waving our Mexican flags in many of the activities and events, even amongst different indigenous circles, right? And we have to, contend with that question because we see the building of a Mexican nation as fundamentally an anti-colonial resistance to European colonialism. And why do we say that? Because the struggles for Mexican liberation and Mexican independence during the anti-colonial struggles of the early 1800s was led primarily by indigenous peoples. It was an indigenous resistance. We had the participation of our African brothers and sisters who were brought to Mexico as slaves to resist in that resistance, right? We have the examples of Vicente Guerrero. We have the examples of Jose Maria Morelos y Pavón, who were fundamentally engaged in an anti-colonial struggle against the power of Spain, ability to continue to enslave our peoples. The anti-colonial struggles as expressed through Benito Juarez, who was the Mexican president during the mid 1800s, who waged a fierce resistance against French colonialism, against the invasion of Mexico by these foreign powers to attempt to recolonize Mexico in the interest of Spain and the interest of the French at that time. And it's today even expressed its struggles, or not today, but in the early 1900s, it expressed its anti-colonial nature with the struggles of Emiliano Zapata, of Francisco Pancho Villa, of all the soldaderas and revolutionaries who were indigenous, who were struggling for the fundamental material basis for our revolution, which was land, tierra y libertad, land and freedom. So our struggle as indigenous peoples is fundamentally rooted in an anti-colonial struggle for reclaiming our lands, our human labor, as well as our territory. And so that for us is fundamental component for understanding what our struggle is as indigenous peoples now here within the occupied territories of Mexico, within what we consider an illegal settler nation that is the United States government and its colonial laws. Just this week, we saw a ruling by the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in this country, that expressed that no longer will refugees have a right to petition to request asylum here in the United States. And what's interesting to us is the fact that these colonial laws, who slander us and consider us foreigners on our own land, they're very clear, and they know very well that the peoples around the world who are escaping the imposed poverty, the war that they have created, the destruction that they have imposed, and the brutal economic exploitation that is a product of capitalism in its more vicious form, more commonly known as neoliberal capitalism, which we consider it very much parasitic capitalism, just in its more savage expression, is kicking people off their land and forcing people to come here because all the resources end up here. And so when it's correct, right? We are here many times because the United States is there, and it continues to advance a colonial relationship, a colonizer relationship with the countries that it believes needs to be conquered or attacked for their natural resources. Just if we look at the situation in Central America for us, we see that reality of Central Americans migrating and moving and coming to the United States is really a consequence again of colonial domination. And it was done, just the coups, the political economic coups that take place in Central America by the United States is that expression of colonialism, and it expresses itself through those coups, through economic intervention, through military intervention, and that is the reason why many people have to leave. But we also, not only do we say that we have a right to migrate as people on our own land, but also the right not to migrate, the right to stay in our countries, to defend our lands, to reclaim our resources, and to fight imperialism there in our own community, so that we don't have to come and deal with the hostility that's found on the border, the persecution that's found in our barrios, and deal with this hostility of a settler white population. But again, it's dealing with if we look at the issues of migration, we deal with the issues of lack of resources, housing, education, it's all a consequence of colonialism. And we can't get into even though we should highlight and expose this hostile expression from the settler population. And it's important that we highlight and express the hostility from the settler population. It's also important for us to highlight the causes the root causes, the material basis of our oppression, because then for our communities, for our peoples, we know that we're working people. We know that we build houses. We know that we can provide food in the shelves of all these groceries and supermarkets. But what's stopping us from having a better way of life and a better conditions of life is, in fact, an economic system that is rooted in colonialism, and that is controlled, an economy that is controlled not by us, the workers, but by capitalist, imperialists who want to continue to maintain those resources for themselves and for the development of their communities, right? And usually it's white communities here in the United States, but we also have to recognize that there are those who are collaborators in neo-colonialism, right? The expression of other nationalities or races that contribute towards the exploitation of our lands, labor, and resources, right? So for us, it's really critical that we see and that we're ideologically understand the same enemy, because it expresses itself they express themselves in the united front against us to try to divide us, to try to divide the rest of humanity, so that they can continue to exploit us, that they can continue to extract our resources and labor. These last couple of weeks, we've seen how the United States is trying to continue to expand its colonial domination over Venezuela. And that for us is really important, because Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution, for us is really an expression. It's at the forefront of an anti-colonial struggle to ensure that the forces of revolution are able to reclaim the material resources for the continent. It's not only a revolution for Venezuela, but it is a continental revolution, as envisioned by Simón Bolívar, by the indigenous peoples of these lands, to do away with these colonial borders. And we see the anti-colonial struggle being expressed through the Bolivarian Alliance of the Peoples of Nuestra America, an economic project that was founded by Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, with the objective of integrating the economies of the South, of Latin America, of the Caribbean, to ensure that colonial domination of the United States, as expressed through the Monroe Doctrine, is defeated. That no longer Latin America will be the backyard of the United States, and the need to build power from within, again, to reclaim our resources and to be able to put it at the service of the people, so that we can have healthcare, education, housing as a fundamental component of a nation state that is committed towards an economic alternative that is not capitalistic, that is socialist, that is run by and for the masses of working people in Latin America. And so with that, I believe I came to time, and I do want to appreciate this discussion, and hopefully we can deepen this conversation on the need to wage anti-colonial struggle and define our struggle as fundamentally being against colonialism. Thank you very much.
Uhuru Benjamin, Uhuru, thank you. And before we go into entertaining questions from our live viewers, and we do have questions rolling in, I wanted to give a couple of extra minutes for our panelists to go ahead and deepen some of the points before we do that. So any of our panelists want to?
Uhuru, thank you. This is great discussion, and I just want to help us to understand that part of what we engage in with this discussion is a war of ideas, and the war of ideas that exist between those of us who are colonized and oppressed Africans, Mexicans, and the vast majority of other people in the world, and against the empire, against imperialism, against the US, and essentially right now, European imperialism. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a growing unity, especially among the colonized. So begin to speak for ourselves, because what has happened in the past, as has been inferred and sometimes explicitly stated during discussion up to now, is that we see sectors of our community and our people, when we open our mouths, it's the bourgeoisie, it's the colonial power that speaks through us. And we see them in demonstrations, we see them in our communities, we see them coming from Africans ourselves. We're talking about peoples who've lost self-confidence because of the colonial domination. So even when you have people who call themselves revolutionaries and leftists and what have you, they don't have often the confidence to even to speak in the interests of their nation, of their peoples, except as that those interests have been expressed through the views of our oppressor. I think is important, you know, like to say and to recognize this. I remember how Africans in Algeria rise up to fight against the French, and the argument by the French, because Algeria, the French had settled in Algeria as well, just like they did in South Africa. They settled in Algeria. They didn't plan to go any place. They were going to be there. And the line that came from the French was that Algeria couldn't be independent. It's a part of France. It's a province of France. That's what Algeria was. And that was the argument. And some Africans in Algeria, though a minority, were able to unite with that in part because there had been a stake in the existence of that social system had been conferred to them. And that happens in this country and around the world too. Sectors of our population, indigenous peoples, have been drawn into the economy of the oppressor, of the colonizer, and our children go to school and are fed by this relationship that happens at the expense of the majority of our people. And this thing with the French is really important, because mention of things like someone was speaking earlier about the various wars. I think it was Comrade Luwezi, that Africans have participated in fighting for the colonizer. I mean, when France fought against Vietnam, 71% of the soldiers, French soldiers, if you will, who fought to maintain Vietnamese colonialism were colonized ourselves from Morocco, from various parts of Africa and what have you, fighting to keep somebody else colonized under French domination. That's the power of ideas. That's what we're talking about now. Why it's so important to say who the hell we are, to define this for ourselves and recognize our relationship with the oppressor. And then, of course, what happened is that when Africans from the United States engaged in that war, some 50 to 65% of the soldiers on the front line fighting against the Vietnamese were colonized African people. And that's not even to speak to the number of Mexicans, the numbers of other Filipinos and other people who fought on the side of the US colonizer against somebody else who was colonized. And somebody would debate us and say that it doesn't make any difference if you call it racism or colonialism. It damn sure makes a difference in material life, because as Malcolm X used to say, that we would go and fight for the white man to kill other people, but we're not fight the white man himself, who was responsible for the condition of our condition and the conditions of the other people. The Vietnamese understood that, however, I'm happy to say. And you know, Ho Chi Minh attended meetings that were held in New York by Marcus Garvey. And speaking of Garvey, the thing that shows the unity of our movements is that the Garvey movement was very powerful. At the same time, the U.S. had to fight Pancho Villa, Zapata. These were contemporary movements, and even Sun Yat-sen from China, who were leading struggles for national liberation. None of them were fighting for racial liberation. They understood our oppression as nations and people, and that's what we were fighting against. And that's when our movements were strongest, when we were able to identify that there was a national oppressor. And then, so we don't believe in race nationalism. We don't engage in like race nationalism. The objective is to liberate ourselves as the people, and that's the struggle that we take into this moment right now in history. So I just think that's important. And I want to say two other things. One is that what has happened the way this whole thing has unfolded for the emergence of capitalism, because the state has always, well, it has existed for a long time, and we can clearly see its emergence in Europe. Has been talked about a lot, written about a lot. Marx, Engels, and a whole bunch of other people have shown how this state has come into existence when those societies got split between contending social forces, where some group of society existed through expropriating value from another group of society. Then the only thing that could keep that exploited group of society from taking it back and killing the exploiters was this instrument that's called the state. And it's represented in form of the police, the prison systems, and whole array of bureaucracy, and that requires the monopoly of violence on the side of the oppressor. And so that's the state. That's something we know. But what has not been addressed adequately is that the capitalist state is different from the states that occurred in Europe. So there was feudalism in Europe. There was what they characterized as slavery in Europe. We saw that state. We saw that instrument that was there for the purpose of maintaining the existing social systems and the existing relations of the oppressed and the oppressor. But with capitalism, capitalism got its birth through colonialism. Capitalism got its birth through what the enslavement of Africans, the enslavement of indigenous peoples in the Americas and other places. And so it had a particular character that distinguished it, that would even allow the white people who were Europeans, who at one juncture bore the brunt of the state oppression. Now they even became instruments of the capitalist state. That's what you see when white mobs and things like that attack us. And that's what the value of what they call racism is, that it informs ordinary white people who otherwise should be fighting against their own capitalist exploiter, one would think, but they benefit from this relationship. And they are now become instruments of the capitalist state, because the capitalist state is a colonial state, is a colonial capitalist state. And all the people who benefit from colonialism benefit from the existence of the capitalist state that kills and terrorizes us. And that's why this stuff can happen to us and has been able to happen to us with the absolute support, with almost near total support from white people. And if you see something different about that, it has been the crisis has become so profound and so deep that white people have to look at their relationship. White people don't have to think about whether or not they support colonialism. Like, you don't think about whether you support breathing. You just do the stuff. You just benefit from it. You exist from it. But when the colonized are now banging on the gates, guns in hand, with threaten the whole operation, then everybody has to begin to rethink their relationship to the system. And then you will find some people who otherwise wouldn't do so come out with their fist in the air, uniting at least superficially with the colonizers, they say. And so, I mean, so this is part of what it is that I think is important for it. It helps to inform us. There's a lot more that can be said, and we don't have enough time for me to be saying that. But I do want to say that that's part of the thing that we have to talk about too, in terms of what is expropriated from us. They take our labor, they take our resources, they take our identity, and even they take our science, they take our culture, they colonize this as well. They expropriate it just like they do everything else, and they put it on the market. So at one time, we were the singers and we were the dancers and all this, and then they criticized singing and dancing as long as it was our singing and our dancing. Then they expropriated that from us. Then they put it on the market and they become the expert dancers and singers, and they create institutions that glorify them as singers and dancers. That's part of what's being stolen from us too. They steal us when we go and fight wars and die for them. That's stolen from us. When we dribble basketballs and throw footballs and kick soccer balls and stuff, that's stolen from us too. When you go and look at any Olympic game, and then you see all of these people who are supposed to be French and supposed to be Canadians and supposed to be Americans and supposed to be, Germans, and increasingly all around the world, you see all these Black people who are now French, Americans, and Germans because it's convenient, it's expropriated, it's parasite. That's the testimony that's the example of the parasitism of this system. And finally, I just want to say happy birthday to Comrade Allison Haney, who is in the furniture store of the Hutu movement, French, and my daughter Kenya, who has a birthday coming up Tuesday. Because if I didn't say those things, I'd be in deep trouble. This is the part of the war of ideas. Uhuru, Comrade Director.
Uhuru. So yeah, we have a couple more minutes, have about 5 more minutes, so we open up to our live audience. Luwezi, did you want to?
Yes, Uhuru, just to say that colonialism cannot satisfy our material interests, but colonialism satisfies the interests of the oppressed nation, and is admitted, from academics to popular levels. That capitalism is the best system the white people never ever have. That's how they put it. From their perspective, this is the best system. They can become homeowners, they can travel anywhere they want to go, they can enjoy, modernity, they can enjoy everything. So that's the best system now. And that's colonialism is experienced by white people, generally speaking. So the necessity to overthrow the narrative of racism is fundamental, because otherwise the starting points for the white population is always there are bad individuals in the system. If we can sort out those bad individuals, to unlearn the racism, we can remove the bad cop, the bad head teacher, or the bad doctor, whoever he is. That's the individual responsibility. Then the system can be perfect. When in reality, we'll be saying that it's rotten at its foundation. That colonialism is the permanent, not just humiliation of a vast majority of colonized people, but is the stealing of the land of the indigenous, is the destruction of African nation, as you can see every day on the television. What the image you see, just image of desolation and the things like that. So the first people of the planet, the African nation, and all the colonized people, they can only have life if colonization is completely overturned. Because now colonization continues in the form of neocolonialism, and this is protected. There's protection of capitalism, because the African petit bourgeoisie, they are happy to fight against racism because they know it means basically reforming colonialism, just maintaining status quo, so to speak. They know that we, the African working class, cannot be satisfied with the fight against racism, because we're not trying to reform one or two individual bad people inside the white nation. We want to overturn the relationship we have so that we can produce for ourselves. Because the only way we can be satisfied when we have an economy that produces for ourselves. At the moment, we don't have. The African independence is there to obscure the colonial contradiction, is to make the majority of people on the planet, including white people, to say Africa is free. African nation is not free. So this struggle to overturn racism is profound. We want everybody to know that. As the chairman said in the beginning, we have the European nation knee on our African nation neck. So we cannot breathe. That's true for all colonized people. And what the wars of Libya overthrowing Gaddafi has to do with racism? What's the war to partition Sudan? Sudan's been partitioned, balkanized. Now they have South Sudan. What has to do? What that reality has to do with racism? The war in Syria, what that has to do with racism? The war in the Congo, the genocide, the current one, genocide in the Congo, what that has to do with racism? The land question in South Africa, what that has to do with racism? We have invaders, settlers owning most of the land, and you go in Africa, you see everybody is satisfied with capitalism. The Lebanese, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Europeans, the Turks, everybody has some kind of African plan, to build themselves at the expense of Africa. This has nothing to do racism. This has to do with neo-colonialism, the betrayal of the African nation by the African petty bourgeoisie, so that the struggle has to be intensified against African petty bourgeoisie, so we can complete the Black Revolution. These are some of the things I want to quickly add.
Uhuru. You know, yeah, if I may, I think that there's really important issue that's happening that has come about as a result of this struggle, right, with George Floyd and this movement that has emerged, and we see even all these corporations now putting out anti-racist statements, right? That we see, emails coming in from corporations who are now taking a position, even, let's say, Black Lives Matter. And so I think that it's important, right? Because, now the oppressor is taking on a position or a role as being now progressive or somehow, on the side of the people with these anti-racist statements, right? Whether it be from Uber or Walmart or all these different companies and corporations, shoe corporations and stuff. And so, you can be take an anti-racist position, but not change the character and nature or structures of the capitalist economic system that creates these terrible conditions for the great majority of our peoples, and yet try to reposition themselves because they see the fragility of their own economic system, because it sits and rests on that pedestal of our oppression. And that's why this contention and war of ideas is so fundamental for our people, because we have to see it beyond just the sentiments of individuals, but more the material basis for creating and reproducing an economic system that works for us, that works for those of us that produce, that create, that generate the massive amounts of wealth for them, right? And overturn that relationship and say, no, we need to reclaim our labor, our land, and our resources for us, for the majority of the people. So I think that's important also to state.
And related to that, I just wanted to say, compañero, every place I traveled in Africa, especially during the period where Hugo Chavez, Comandante Hugo Chavez, played a commanding role in the struggle of oppressed peoples. I'm talking Hugo Chavez, of course, as the person. Africans all over the continent love Hugo Chavez and loved him because of his stance in opposition to colonialism. And so I was really struck by that. And, that takes us beyond this whole question, like of defining, things in terms of what they call racism. And what we find is a growing unity of the oppressed peoples. We believe, as the African People's Socialist Party, we recognize that while Africa is our motherland, that we are also a part of the revolution of the Americas. I mean, we are everywhere in the Americas, and part of what the Americas look like is a response to the work and oppression of African people throughout the Americas. And so our unity and solidarity with all of our people here in the Americas is real. And it is not based on, some artificial contest or some contrived contest with the Mexican people or the indigenous people. And that happens sometimes in our own communities. We hear certain kinds of arguments and put forth about freedom for African people that somehow would come at the expense of Mexicans or other indigenous people. We don't believe in that at all. We are part of the revolution of the Americas, and we know that our exploitation and oppression did not come about as we understand today as a consequence of the white man or imperialism coming to this land and taking this land from African people, or taking, et cetera. The traditional custodians of this land have been the indigenous peoples, and we are part of the revolutionary project because it put all of us in subjugation. And so our objective is to unite with the indigenous people to slay the slave master and destroy slavery. Uhuru.
Uhuru.
Director Uhuru.
Uhuru. Yes. So, I mean, that is just been a powerful discussion so far, and we're not done. We do have questions from our online viewers, but first want to acknowledge where people are watching from. And we currently have occupied Azania, or South Africa, St. Louis, Missouri, St. Petersburg, Florida, Hempstead, New York, Ghana, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Queens, New York, Charlotte, North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina, Pinellas Park, Florida, Trinidad, Spokane, Washington, Newark, New Jersey, Tampa, Florida, London, Kuwait, Australia, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, West Michigan, San Diego, California, Gainesville, Florida, Nairobi, Huntsville, Alabama, Richmond, Virginia, Oakland, California, Colorado, and Fayetteville, North Carolina. So that's where people are watching from. So I want to thank you all for tuning in, no matter where it is that you are, and continue to invite your friends and family to this study. And we are going to now go into one of our first questions comes from Morty in Richmond, Virginia. And it's directed towards Chairman. Is there a contradiction in the term institutional or structural racism? They're popularized by bourgeois media / academia. Why do they invent new terms when colonialism already exists?
That's one way. They have to recognize the existence of colonialism. They just want to give it a name that satisfies their ideological interpretation of reality, which is racism. Because racism, you're not fighting, again, you have no material interest in racism. You just see that these, and they've been forced to do that. They've been forced to say that it's institutionalized racism. Once you began to struggle against racism and raise up the colonial contradiction to liquidate the colonial question or to obscure it or to hide it, they want to give it a racial clothing. So they say, this institutional racism, and they define institutional racism based on the very same features of colonialism for the most part. And so it's a method of obscurantism that our colonial oppressors are using in this instance. And it's also a place they've retreated to that position. They'd rather not even recognize the institutions or but the demand for the defeat of colonialism is required for them to make those kinds of statements. Frantz Fanon, I was looking at something recently saying that one of the contributing things that Fanon did, and there's a lot to when we can unite with that came from Fanon, is that he recognized that when you look at colonialism, what's extremely important is that all of the injuries, I mean, we look at our communities, we were talking about this perhaps before this study began, or perhaps during the first study, how the damage that's been done to our people, the people are mentally and spiritually just crushed by colonialism. And one thing that Fanon recognized that I agree with, that the colonized can only be cured through killing the colonizer. That violence is plays an extraordinarily important role in the liberation of the colonized, and that it is one of the cleansing, things. I mean, you look at the inhumanity. I said sometime during this discussion that there are no words that one can use that can adequately describe what the colonialists did to us, what the Spaniards did to the indigenous people here, what all of them have done to us. There are pictures that we can see in Algeria of white men standing up in their iconic colonial clothing next to stacks of heads, human heads. People have been decapitated, and they're the photos made famous in this country of white families, children, women, men, the delicate white woman you know, with her delicate white children who can't look at video games because they're too violent, standing and pointing at Africans who have been massacred, hanging in trees or being torched. You know, I mean, these are the things that have happened to us. There is not going to be any easy way out of this for any of us. We're going to have to fight like hell to get out of here. And the way that part of the curative thing, and I say this because I see a lot of Africans who talk about how, you know, we got to heal ourselves. Yeah, heal yourself with an AK. I mean, I think that the healing process is a lot more involved and interesting than what they would have. There's an assumption that you can heal in the system. You can heal in the system. You know, there are not enough universities producing enough psychiatrists to provide some kind of healing balm for what colonialism has done and what colonialism does do to us today. That's going to be something. Self-healing is absolutely necessary in this instance. Uhuru. No allopathic medicines. It's going to actually be natural medicines to get rid of the consequences of colonialism. Uhuru.
Uhuru. And at any point in time, any of the other panelists can contribute to, you know, answering that question. So, Benjamin.
Yeah, I think that it's important, right? So academia tries to redefine and work on different terms, right? I think one of them is historical trauma, to describe colonialism as a way to say, oh, it's just a traumatic experience that people have over decades. Yeah, that's true, but let's not change or try to decenter the historical anti-colonial struggle that we've done as a peoples, to try to redefine this condition that we're in, right? So colonialism as a function, right, and by its nature, it's violent. It is violent, right? And it's true. You know, the only way that our peoples have historically been able to reclaim our lands is through, it has historically been through those violent contentions with power, right? And so this role of academia to try to then, you know, self-healing and historical trauma, you know, is a diversion from what is clearly has to be an anti-colonial struggle, so that we're not just dealing with the symptoms of the problem, but getting to the root cause, the material basis of our oppression. And that is a question of land, labor, and resources that is tied up with this terrible system called capitalism. And we have to now reimagine what a world beyond capitalism looks like. What does that mean? And I think you know, the African People's Socialist Party is very much you know, on that path in building these dual institutions that serve the people, right? And that's why it's really important to really support those projects, whether it be the Uhuru Food and Pies, the centers, the you know, the Burning Spear as an important ideological guide, all these institutions of dual and contending power. And I think that's really important. Thank you.
May I just say one other thing, just in terms of this bourgeois academic obscurantism, you know, like, and diversion. Like, one such thing is this, you know, sometimes the thing is not to say that this doesn't exist, but to take it from the center, to take it to destroy its significance as a driving force, a defining factor, like intersectionality, whatever the hell that is, you know, like intersection. Out here you have the intersection, and that's what we have to deal with, the intersection of women's oppression, homosexual oppression, Black oppression, Mexicans. All of us have this, there's this intersectionality that we have to deal with, right? And that is to obscure and liquidate the colonial question as the driving fundamental factor. And then you have these pop ideologists, pop ideologues who would throw in everything, you know, it's colonialism, it's capitalism, it's patriarchy, you know, etc. And this is really powerful because you say patriarchy, right? This is the petty bourgeoisie. They're introducing the oppression of women. They're really in front of the question now. They're really on the top list of the hierarchy of progress when they say patriarchy. And it's nonsense. I mean, you got talking about patriarchy being the problem. where, you know, I forgot how many millions Africans, they say, have disappeared, and African men have disappeared inside this country, where something like there are only 80 some odd African men for every 100 African women in this country, where there are only, if in Ferguson, there are only 64 African men for every 100 African women. And it's colonialism that created that situation, and patriarchy is a factor in the whole European question. In Europe, that's a history of their relationship, etc. But the colonial contradiction is the fundamental contradiction. And in so saying, it shouldn't be necessary. I know it's not necessary for whom I'm talking to right now. It does not liquidate or obscure the conditions that African women have to contend with, but can we imagine? Is it possible to imagine free African women if African people are not free? It's absolutely absurdity. It's the colonized condition of African people that we have to confront with, and African women have to be brought into the front lines of that struggle against colonialism. And that's how African women would define for themselves what freedom looks like in the process of destroying the colonial oppressor who has raped and misused African women historically as a part of a colonial and subject population. That's how we get oppressed, as a colonial and subject population. That's how we're going to win our liberation. Uhuru, yeah.
Yes, well, I might just say quickly, this question of institutionalized racism, the fundamental question, who is your leadership? That's really a fundamental question. You know, where it's coming from? Who's putting it in the world? Because, you know, you hear that a lot here in France and so on. And this is also part of, as the chairman said, to obscure the fundamental question. If you go to colonies like in Africa, for example, you hear the rule of the law, the rule of law.
Yeah.
You hear good governance.
Yeah.
You know, what do you mean good governance? To be a good governor of the colony, to be the honest, you know, administrator of colonialism, the one who does not steal anything, like I'm told the president of Tanzania, you know, you won't say want to be efficient, you know, but under colonialism, which means Africa is being looted. People are dying in every other way. So we just have to be clear that the fundamental question is colonialism, and we have to start from the beginning. What's the beginning of this system? You know, and where we are, because every stage must help us to deepen the question, to deepen our understanding. We're trying to overturn the verdict of imperialists. So we're going from the beginning. We're trying to overturn the fact that the African nation have been made to be basically the colony of imperialism, basically. That the foundation, the starting point of the success of Europe is colonialism, which is basically the domination of African and African people everywhere. So wherever you are, your struggle must be a development of that struggle. And that's why African internationalism is just on point, because it's basically from the first start, we say our mission is to overturn the whole system. We're not saying we want to modify this. We're trying from the best way to do that. Now we say the starting point for us to have a collective success is to overturn the whole thing. And then we can, you know, see, you know, how this work, how we can move this. But starting point is that overturn the whole thing for collective success. And that's the mission of the African working class.
Which requires the destruction of all the colonial borders in the world that separate us from each other, that separate us from our resources, that separate us from the other peoples of the world. Those borders have to go. They're fundamental. There is not going to be any African freedom in some single location that has been created by colonial capitalism. The whole damn thing has to come down. All of them, every border. And the borders are used to reproduce these social forces. That's the condition for their reproduction. They got to go. And so, yeah, Are there other questions? I don't want us to, we'll speak to this one forever.
Yes, and depending on, well, anyway, I was gonna say maybe we could probably take one more question just based on time, but there was one question from M.A. Brown asking if, Chairman, if you could elaborate on avoiding race nationalism.
Avoiding race nationalism?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that's, just another means of fighting, letting this whole false concept, this false construct of race to define what it is that we're about and where it is that we're trying to go. And there are basic features, we think, that can, of what nations are. And that they came into existence based on material conditions in the world. And there are subjective and objective factors to determining what a nation is. And an aspect of that, of course, is a sense of sameness, self-consciousness, a subjective factor, which would allow me to be sitting up in Berlin with Comrade Luwezi in a meeting with attended by Africans from 13 different so-called countries from around the world. And the comment came up about what happened in New Orleans and Katrina. And Africans watched that. And an African who was born in the Caribbean, living in France, was saying that we have to have our own Black Ankh to deal with this. I mean, just horrified of seeing African people. There was a sense of sameness from this African and other Africans, from Ethiopia and various other places in that meeting, Suriname, born in Suriname, absolutely appalled and united in recognizing that there is a sense of sameness. We are one people. And it's something that we experience, and every time we come together, we have a discussion. Africans, if someone watched the event that we did via Zoom on the 20th anniversary of Let's Get Free album by Dead Prez, and where one of the persons who attended that participated was Asa Anpu, who lives in what they call South Africa, and how he was thrilled to hear African on that album from Dead Prez coming from the United States saying, we are Africans, we are Africans, we are Africans. And he said, you want to be here? This whole thing. So that there is an aspect of subjectiveness there. There's a subjective factor, a sense of sameness that we experience, but there are also there's a material basis for this definition, and it is important too. And you can be misguided and misled by race nationalism that will not allow you to understand who your enemy is if that person is of the same race, who your friends are if that person is not of the same race as it's been characterized. So the race thing is a false construct that's used to obscure real relationships that exist between human beings. And in America, what race has been used to do in this much of the world is to obscure the national interest that African people may have, African people have as a nation. And so we find race nationalists who would put on Black berets and combat boots and what have you in the face of this contest existing between China and the United States, where the Chinese sort of understand where their national interests are, whether you agree with them or not, but they're certainly undermining the hegemony of the US in the world right now, which is to our benefit. And so you would have Africans going Black power, wearing berets and combat gear, boycotting a Chinese restaurant in the United States because some Chinese treated Africans in China badly because they said that the Africans were responsible for the coronavirus there. That's race nationalism. So they go Black power at a Chinese restaurant, not even able to recognize the oppression of the African nation is not being done by Chinese in China, or certainly at the damn restaurant. So race nationalism is just something that's misdirecting and misinforming and satisfy people just to see a black skin. It's not what we are talking about. We are revolutionary. We are African internationalists, and we engaged in national liberation, not racial liberation. I don't even know if that's a viable concept, et cetera. Uhuru. I'm afraid I did not speak adequately to that, but I hope I conveyed something of what helps me to differentiate this.
Yes, well, Chairman, as you're always splendid, Chairman. We appreciate that. I just want to say, usually when you hear that kind of thinking, we already say we all African nations dominated, including the African petty bourgeoisie. The African petty bourgeoisie doesn't tell the white bourgeoisie what to do. It's the other way around. But the problem is, one of the problems that with race nationalism is that it's a clear intent not to fight the African petty bourgeoisie. You know, and instead of saying the African petty bourgeoisie is responsible for this and this and that, the race nationalists will say we are responsible for that. Who are we? Not the workers, not the peasant. The African petty bourgeoisie was responsible today for betraying our struggle. Can you just imagine 6 years of deepening of our struggle? Africa, the African nation, would have been freed already, but the African petty bourgeoisie chose to be in partnership with our oppressors at the expense of the African nation. And the race nationalists can't do that. If they do criticize somebody, they will criticize him as an individual. They will not criticize the African petty bourgeoisie as a class, as a social class, but as an individual. They will not do that. That's why you have African, race nationalists or Pan-Africanists who support Paul Kagame, who is clearly a murderer that Africans should arrest and put to trial straight away. And, Museveni, who is opposed to reparation, he should be dismissed from power straight away. But Museveni hosted the Pan-Africanist Conference in 1994 to obscure the US plan of genocide in Rwanda. The US knew what they were doing, and Pan-Africanists were caught in Uganda when they announced that the plane that was carrying the president of Rwanda and Burundi was shut down, and that was the signal for genocide, basically, or the spark of it. Because they were in bed with Museveni, because they don't recognize this fundamental class question. And the other thing is, they don't recognize a revolution as the solution. Most of them don't recognize that. They'll say, oh, we need our own culture, our own religion, all that. But, the pharaohs, they were in control of our religion, but we were defeated by the invaders at one point in our history. You just have to recognize that. It's an objective, reality. It's just true. We lost our control of Africa a while ago, something like that. So I just wanted to say those two things. Yes.
Well, you take that same thing. I mean, Du Bois and the French. Du Bois and the French, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the first political Pan-Africanist movement, highly political, the one that defines Pan-Africanism today, happened in 1919 in Paris, France. And this was with the assistance of the French colonialists, and also facilitated by Blaise Diagne, who was a part of from Senegal, who was a part of the French Parliament at the time where France colonized Senegal, much of Africa, and in fact, he had primary responsibility for running throughout West Africa to get African people to fight for France in the First Imperialist War. He facilitated for the French, the first Pan-Africanist Congress that ever happened. That was in 1919. And that Pan-Africanist Congress was founded in contention with the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League that was created by Marcus Garvey. And even today, you have Pan-Africanists and other liberal Africanists who unite with Du Bois as opposed to Garvey, because Garvey was for all Africa, for Africans, those at home and those abroad, and Du Bois was for the talented 10th, that he was the NAACP who had promoted the whole notion that the talented 10% of the African population, the educated, and the rest of them should dominate the rest of us, and in the interest of imperialism. So that's the consequences of a certain kind of race nationalism that will not allow you to distinguish one African from another, regardless of what kind of responsibility that African may have for our liberation or for our oppression. Uhuru.
And we do have to say, as Union del Barrio, we reject, this reactionary nationalism or race nationalism as the basis of our struggle. We reject that because it lends to those tendencies of reaction, of oppression, and actually facilitates the division of our peoples, oppressed, colonized peoples throughout the world.
Sure.
Because we do have to have an internationalism and see ourselves as part of a humanity that is struggling against our common oppressors, right? And so that's I think it's fundamentally important for us as Raza internationalists, even though Raza internationalists, to articulate our rejection of that narrow nationalism that does exist. But we are engaged in a national liberation struggle that unites with the oppressed peoples around the world to actually, we say that, yeah, we'll be willing to put away our flag and uphold, a flag that represents all of humanity, as long as it's in the context of eliminating that system of oppression and exploitation that has divided us as a human species. So that's really important for us also to clarify.
Well, race nationalism is responsible for even the first of these studies that we did, to have comments saying that why should we be working with Mexicans or something to that effect, when anyway, it liquidates any ability to have race nationalism would maintain a permanent isolation of the oppressed working classes, from a relationship with others of our class brothers and sisters. So we may not be immediately defined as parts of the same nation, but we're working on that too. But certainly we can say these are our class allies, our class brothers and sisters that we are working with. Comrade Director, I know that you oh, hell yes. Uhuru, go ahead.
Uhuru. Wow. I can interrupt that discussion. I think that people appreciate it, so I just really want to appreciate and just really salute this panelist and salute our leadership, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, for this brilliant study. And, we will continue to engage with this discussion around, the struggle against colonialism as the struggle of African and colonized workers of the world. So just really want to appreciate all of you, Chairman SG Luwezi and SG Benjamin. So with that being said, because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question was not answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman does see your question. And also any of our panelists, because I know some of those questions were directed towards specific panelists. So we'll make sure that these panelists do receive your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, winning the war of ideas. For your revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music heard by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via our Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. If you united with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party, no matter where it is you're located on the planet Earth, you can visit apspuhuru.org for information regarding how you can join. And to learn more about Union del Barrio, visit uniondelbarrio.org to contact, access publication, read articles from UDB, and more. Order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest books, Vanguard, The Advanced Attachment of the African Revolution, as well as the one that Chairman read from this morning, An Uneasy Equilibrium, at burningspearmarketplace.com. Support radio in the hands of the Black community. Donate, volunteer, become a supporting member, or renew your support. Mark your calendar now and get ready to tune in July 3rd through the 18th for the Black Power 96 July Member Fund Drive, packed with special programming and give backs for when you donate. As part of our drive on July 3rd, Black Power 96 is hosting the Freedom Mic Black Power Matters virtual concert featuring more than 10 African artists ranging from St. Petersburg, Florida to occupied Azania in South Africa. Broadcasting live from Black Power 96 FM Facebook page and the Burning Spear YouTube page starting at 7 p.m. Eastern. Learn more about this event and ways you can support Black Power 96 at blackpower96.org. Make Belgium Pay Reparations to Africa demonstration happening on Tuesday, June 30th at 4 p.m. GMT on Congo Independence Day, taking place at the Belgium Embassy located at 17 Grosvenor Crescent, London, United Kingdom, demanding reparations for stolen labor, land, and lives. And you can access more information about this demonstration at the Luwezi Kinshasa like page on Facebook. The African National Women's Organization is hosting the Black Women's Convention themed Sisters United for the Revolution, happening July 11th and 12th. And you can register today at Anwo Uhuru, that's ANWO Uhuru.org. We're calling on people to follow the All African Peoples Development and Empowerment Project at their website or on their Facebook, developmentforafrica.org, for important information and helpful tips in regards to COVID-19. I'm sure everybody is seeing the quote unquote second wave of the coronavirus within the US. And this is a really important time for us to take this question seriously and visit developmentforafrica.org and AppDep's Facebook page to get all the information you need regarding that. Uhuru Furniture Stores in Oakland and Philadelphia go live on Facebook every week to highlight beautiful new pieces and build African economic self-determination. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, you can tune in every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time at facebook.com/Uhuru Furniture Philly. In Oakland, California, tune in every Wednesday and Saturday at 12 p.m. Pacific Time at facebook.com/Uhuru Furniture Oak. Lastly, to keep up with our movement events, because we have so many, you can visit theburningspear.com's events page and subscribe to our mailing list so you can get immediate updates. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.
Uhuru.
Uhuru.